What are your favorite ones? Where when we mix up subjective first-hand experience and we just kind of leave it behind, what kind of paradoxes emerge?
Well, like I said, I think the first one is quantum mechanics, right? So let's just talk a little bit about that. In
Yeah,
quantum mechanics, there's two pieces of quantum mechanics. There's two equations fundamentally that make up quantum mechanics. One is the Schrodinger equation, which everybody has heard. And Schrodinger equation is what evolves if you have a system, an atom, an electron, that's what evolves it forward in time. It's what's called a dynamical equation. It tells you how the system will change over time. And, physicists, we love our dynamical equations because they allow us to make predictions, right? So Newton's equations, which I can use to predict, the motions of planets billions of years into the future, is an example of a dynamical equations. Maxwell's equations, which are predict electromagnetic fields and their evolution, is a dynamical equation. So, yay, we have a dynamical equation. But what happens with quantum mechanics is there's another part. There's the second piece, which is what's called the Born rule. And what the Born rule says is, sure, the dynamical equation is great. It tells you how the system evolves until you look at it, until
yeah,
a measurement is made. And when the measurement is made, the Schrodinger's equation is fired. You're literally like, stop, don't use that anymore. Now you use the Born rule, which tells you about the probabilities for what might happen when you actually look. It uses what came from from Schrodinger's equation, but then, freezes that and then uses this other rule, which assigns probabilities to different outcomes. And so the Born rule is the measurement problem, that there's this extra piece. And while Bohr and Heisenberg and in the first generation of thinkers recognized the difficulty or the newness, the novelty of this, that now measurement, which is done by measurers, now is going to step in. What it happened is that, like, really, especially when quantum mechanics, the center of physics, came to the United States, we're so pragmatic that we were like, who cares about that? I'm just going to make quantum toasters. And many a quantum toaster we did make. We produced profound technologies. But there was really this kind of like, oh, don't even think about that. That's just crazy
yeah.
stuff, whatever. And then you started to get interpretations in like the 50s, like the Everett's many worlds interpretation, which then people kind of flocked to because, as one researcher said, the Born rule, this part where the measurement is I love this quote, it is a ugly scar on an otherwise beautiful theory, which I think is hilarious. It's not an ugly scar. It's a fundamental part of the theory, man. You
Right.
either got to deal with it or you got to pretend it doesn't exist. And I think as a physicist, you should deal with it. And so, what's really interesting is that there's, a new version, new kinds of interpretations of quantum mechanics called quantum Bayesianism, or the most developed version is what's called cubism, that come out of the frontiers of quantum mechanics, which is now quantum information theory. That's how we're going to build a quantum computer. And in those ones, the Born rule is the beginning. Like, that's where you start, is with the Born rule. You recognize that you're the measurer, you're not going to try and say, oh, electrons are the measurer. No, you're the one who made the measurement. You're an agent interacting with the world. The world pushes back. So that has, we don't need to go down that road, but that quantum Bayesianism has a radical reinterpretation of what even science is. It's always about agents, autonomous agents, experiencers, interacting with the world and the world pushing back. So that's one place that this
Super
happens.
interesting. Really
Yeah,
well
very
explained as well. I just love how you explain these things. Hard, complicated topics, but that was really clear.
Yeah, thank you. You should have Chris Fuchs on. Chris Fuchs is the guy who sort of founded Cubism. You'd enjoy a conversation with him.
I think I've
Um,
emailed him. I'll have to hit him up again.
keep poking him. Keep poking him.
Yeah, I will do.
And then another place is like, so now, in the book, what we did in the blind spot, in the book, we started with, quantum mechanics, matter. We also talked about time. I won't go through that right now. But then we went on to like biology, cognitive science, and consciousness. So from the biological perspective, you have this idea of, organisms being machines. They're just machines made out of goo.
Yeah.
They're just biochemical mechanisms. And what you see there is like there's all kinds of problems with that metaphor, because that again was trying to like push the sentient nature. Like, we would argue that all life has some degree of sentience. A bacteria that is undergoing chemotaxis, meaning movement because it's trying to get food, right? It's when a bacteria moves up a gradient of, say, sugar, to get food. That is an example of sentient. The bacteria is not just bumping into the world. It's got its own needs, its
Yeah.
own desires. It's got an itch it needs to scratch. That's kind of the basic level of sentience. No machine we've ever built it has its own itch it wants to scratch. You can program an itch in, but that's not what happened with the bacteria or is happening with the bacteria. So this idea of life as machines is sort of the fundamental flaw of the blind spot. Life is something quite mysterious, not that it's not amenable to scientific investigation, but it's the self-organization of living systems, what is called autopoiesis, the closure. The system is closed, to its own causes. It is its own cause. That is like a completely new way of thinking about organisms and dealing with their potential for experience, that they have experience. They have an inside and an outside, so to speak. So in biology, the main thing that happens here is recognizing that they're not machines. They are a very particular kind of organization, self-organization, that happens in no other kind of physical system, right?
Yes.
And then you get to like cognition, right? Because even bacteria have some form of cognition. Now, obviously, the higher up you get, the more, when you start developing nerve cells and such, your cognition becomes even more refined. But cognition, the often what you get is when people talk about cognition, it's a computational model. It's just algorithms, So now it's a computing machine, right? And the brain is just a computing machine. And that you run into huge problems with because, as
Yeah.
was recognized even by Daniel Dennett, if that's your idea, then you don't even have any idea about how did your computing machine figure out what's important, right? There's what's called relevance realization. You and I can recognize if we have a problem, which of the infinite things that we're looking at is relevant to our problem because it's our problem. If you tried to program that from scratch, you end up, this is what Dennett showed and other people have showed, you end up in an infinite regress and you'd have a robot that never knew what to do, never knew how to pick out what was relevant and what was not relevant. Cognitive science did what's called computationalism, that the brain is a computer. You run into all kinds of problems with that. So, I won't keep going on this, but like almost in and then you get to consciousness and it's really a huge problem. But this reductionism, what we called the
Yeah.
blind spot, was a bunch of different kind of philosophical views. One was reductionism, which we've talked about. One was this idea of the objective frame, that, science gives us a view of like the God's eye view of the universe, independent, forever independent of us. And our perspective was there's no such thing as the objective view. You're always trapped. Not trapped. This is how you encounter the world, is through your perspective. So
Yes.
if you do not acknowledge the centrality, the primacy of experience, you just end up with all these paradoxes. Then you have to go through these crazy mental yoga poses to try and get around like the many worlds interpretation. And it's just, it's kind of a waste of time when there's new problems to be solved once you acknowledge it.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I think, again, just super well explained. What's not as clear to me is what we do about it. So, how do we take subjective experience and place it to be the most paramount, important part of all other sciences? Should there be equations for subjective experience developed? I know people trying to work on that, which kind of fries my brain because I don't know how that even works. But should we be developing mathematical frameworks around subjective experience? Should physics equations have subjective experience terms? Like, how do we place the right amount of importance on subjective experience?
Well, Evan, you're asking the $1 billion question. And
Right.
but and the thing is, like, that is the good work that has to be done, right? I mean, so when I wrote that chapter on, it made sense, at the time, and I was tracking the literally centuries long development that got us to the point where we could have an equation, with that we understood inertia and we understood velocity and we like these basic kinematics. It took literally like a couple of centuries for people to work out what was the right way to have a Newtonian Newtonian physics. Like that took, just in the same way. I don't think it'll take centuries, but we're just at the beginning of this. And so actually our group, I don't have an answer for you. I have directions I think we can point in. And we'll have to see what happens. But I think one of the things that comes if you really want to take experience as central, the first thing you have to do is there's some philosophical work to do in terms of understanding what a theory means then, right? Are you asking for an explanation or are you asking for an account? Because there's difference between the two of them, right? There may be a way which you're never going to explain consciousness from first principles, right? That's not, but you can give an account for how aspects of it work. Because once you recognize that experience is a whole, it's a whole, right? There's no atoms of experience. It is a whole or a holism. Then, that also means that like, you kind of have to jump into the circle, as Heidegger would have said. You can't start from a bunch of premises and then work your way up. So one thing is sort of like working out the kind of philosophical idea of what does the science look like? What does science look like when you take experience as central? And then the other thing when it comes to formal accounts, because we're actually working on a project right now, myself, and my collaborators Marcelo and Evan and my Gaurav Ghoshal, who's a network theorist here, and we have collaborators at Santa Fe. One thing that you want to think about is that what you might need if you want formal theories, right, meaning mathematical theories, you might need also to have theories that know how to self-destruct, right? Because the problem with what happened with classical physics is they were super powerful, right? You get Newtonian physics, and then people advance Newtonian physics, and you get Lagrange's formulation of Newtonian physics, which is a more powerful way of doing it than thinking about forces, because that was very cumbersome. And then you get the Hamiltonian formulation of classical physics, which is in this weird hyperdimensional phase space. And these things were all super powerful. But if you don't know when to stop, if you don't know when to say like, okay, now it's not applicable anymore, right? Then you end up trying to stretch these things into places where you're going to get yourself into trouble. And you suddenly, like, now you have to spend all your time dealing with the paradox that you came up to because of that. So I think one of the things is to understand if I'm going to try and develop, like right now, what I'm very interested in is what we call a physics of agency, right? To me, agency is the primary problem.
Very
because,
cool.
right, interior experience, what we would call phenomenal experience, I'm not sure science is ever going to really have an explanation for that. It's a given, right? From the Zen perspective, what we would say in Zen is that's what's called suchness. It is just given. It's where you start. Yeah. Whitehead, who we love, Whitehead, who was one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century, he would also have said, like, there's a certain way in which experience is given to you, He called it the concrete. Like, so he had the idea that the do not mistake the abstract for the concrete, right? And its philosophy's job is to explain the abstract, not the concrete. The concrete is just given to you, and that's where you would start. Yeah. So the formal system, so if agency, so the reason I'm bringing up agency is I think, like, rather than trying to explain experience, what we can do is find a way of talking about it that hits an essential problem that you might be able to describe in a formal setting. And that's agency, autonomous agency, right? Because the thing about what is an agent? An agent is a system, right, that has an interior and exterior, that has already, has its own motivations, its own goals. And there's ways you could describe that in terms of what we call viability, right? And every agent wants to maintain its own viability. Now, if you're talking about a cell, that's very easy to understand. What is viability? I'm alive. My battery still has energy. If you're talking about a human being, viability starts to become complicated. Like, not only do I want to stay alive, I want to have friends. I want to have a meaningful job, So, so this idea that, like, we can say there are these things called agents that have their own needs and goals, and they're autonomous, meaning that, nobody's programming them from the outside. They are self-organized systems. That is something, and we're trying to work on that is something that you might be able to begin to think about trying to develop an account for. Like, what is the organization? This is something we're working on. What is the organization or the architecture of information flow that allows autonomous agency? So that is like a nice, clear problem, or it's becoming clear, that we're trying to work on. Can you have a theory of semantic, i.e. meaningful information, in the same way that we have Claude Shannon's theory of syntactic, information where like there's no meaning to it. It's just, just symbols and their probabilities. So it's these kinds of questions I think that are the opening to
Yeah.
having a post blind spot science.
Super cool. Super, super cool. How much do you think this information flow in biology and figuring out agents plays into what people really know you for, which is life on other planets? You know, how life emerged in different ecosystems, how life emerged. Like, how much do you think what you said there really is relatable to, finding life on Mars, finding life on all these other planets?
Yeah, it's funny how I got led here, right? Because you're right. For the last, my own scientific career, I started off doing computational astrophysics of
Yeah.
stars dying, which is totally cool, but it's a long way from what I'm doing now. And that's a beautiful thing about a career in science is you get led various places. I did 10 years of doing that, and then I did 10 years of star formation. And studying star formation led me to planet formation, and that led me to exoplanet science. And I did stuff on the atmospheres of exoplanets. And then I was like, screw this, man. What I'm really interested in is life. So, I'm now still very involved in work in astrobiology and in particular, what are called technosignatures, which is the study looking, how can we find intelligent civilizations at a distance and, on exoplanets orbiting stars, on planets orbiting stars, hundreds of light years away. So the problem actually in thinking about that, I was led to think about life. What is life? Like what constitutes life? What makes life unique? Because the cool thing about working in astrobiology is you are forced, if you really want to do it, you are forced to try and start thinking about the unthinkable, trying to start imagining the unimaginable, right? Because as everyone, one of the first things people will say to you, if you're an astrobiologist is like, yeah, but what about non-carbon based forms of life, right? Which is a totally reasonable thing. What if water's not that important? Totally reasonable thing to ask. So then you have to
Yeah.
ask is like, well, what if everything I know about life on Earth is just one particular instance and there's many other ways of doing this? So then you start
Right.
asking, in general, right? Forget carbon or water. What makes life? What makes something living as opposed to non-living? And then you start thinking about like, oh, it's information. Like that's one way. Like life is the only physical system in the universe that uses information. I can describe other things in terms of information, like a rock, but the rock doesn't care. The rock doesn't use information, and I can describe the rock other ways that's just as good. But really, there's no way to talk about life without the the detection, storage, transfer, and processing of information. So,
Yes.
that's where these overlap. And then what's happening now is I'm getting so excited about the physics of life that I'm kind of like doing less of the astrobiology and more of the physics of life stuff.
So cool. This is a recently I've spoken to Nick Lane and Lee Cronin, and
Oh
they
yeah.
have differing opinions on this, which really interest me. So Nick sort of thinks that there's good reason to believe why, or good reason to why life is the way it is. And that if we did ever meet life on other planets, there is some reason to believe that it would be actually maybe kind of like us. Like, the information scaffold is likely not to be made of DNA and RNA, but there's probably some protein equivalent. There's probably some metabolism equivalent. It's almost certainly carbon based. And then Lee is like, that's bullshit. I talked to him this week, and Lee was just like, that's horse shit. There's no reason to believe any of that. Like, he's anthropomorphizing. There's absolutely no reason to believe that life would be like literally anything. You can't make any predictions whatsoever. And I was kind of convinced by Nick, and then I'm kind of okay. Lee has a point, and I don't really know. What do you think about this?
Yeah, it's interesting. Lee loves to like push, and I love the way Lee often does push in directions.
Yes.
Um, I've been part of a project that he's involved in. I've been one kind of the referees or whatever, where he was thinking about, sort of like light as being, a planet where light could become alive or light could be the mechanism of, and it was very creative. But I think I would come down if I had to make a choice. I think, listen, nature is way more imaginative than we are. So in terms of
Yeah,
like saying that
that's true.
anything, I would never say when it comes to life that anything can't happen. But I think I'm going to agree with Nick more than is that, because one of the interesting things is people say, like, yeah, well, come on, carbon based life, you guys need to be more creative. But if you look at the periodic table and you're like, oh, yeah, if I had to build life, I'd use carbon because
Yeah,
carbon 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 is very how do I say this in a way that won't get me in trouble? Carbon is very promiscuous, right? Carbon
Say the
loves to
way that's going to
bond
make
with
you
everybody.
most in trouble. Say that.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, I'm not going to say that. It's carbon loves to bond, loves to make bonds that are strong enough that they can withstand, getting knocked around, but not so strong that now it's a cage, right? So water, same thing. Like if you had to choose a solvent that would help chemical reactions along, you'd choose water because ammonia, sure, maybe, but so not that there not might be other possible, but the it's really interesting, and I'm not a chemist, right? So this has been new to me, but like looking at the periodic table and being like, oh, like the noble gases, not gonna happen with because like they're noble. They
Yeah.
don't want to interact with anybody. You're not gonna get the kind of complexity, the possibilities of emergence out of anything built out of the noble gases. So it is really interesting. I think we should expect to be surprised for sure. But I
Yeah.
do think there's, when you look at what we're built out of, there's a certain way of like, oh yeah, that made sense. If I was starting from scratch, I would probably use carbon and water,
Yes.
So, but I think we're going to be surprised and especially the idea, like, the whole UFO thing with like the humanoids with the head and the big eyes, like, no way.
That's
Evolution.
absurd.
Now,
Yeah.
when it comes to evolution, yeah, evolution works on so many accidents that there's no way you're getting our body plan anywhere else. I don't think so. So, yeah. But the idea that basically chemistry, matter as the substrate, the information bearing substrate, I think there's pretty good reasons to think that will happen a lot. Doesn't mean it's the only thing that's happened.
Yes.
Giant news. We created a completely free ebook titled 26 Neuroscience Books for 2026. I've read over 100 neuroscience books in my life, and with Christmas just around the corner, I thought I would help people find the perfect book for them or to buy for someone in their life. It includes really nice science-based illustrations, an accessibility guide, and personally written segments for each book and the impression they left on me. I also asked 100 top scientists like Dr. Mike Levin, Anil Seth, Nick Lane, and many more what their favorite science book is, and you can find all of those included at the end. If you want to support the channel, you can also purchase a beautiful physical paperback copy, also a perfect stocking filler. We put a lot of effort into our first Giant Shoulder product, and we cannot wait to hear your thoughts. Check it out in the link below. Again, it's completely free.